Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 43 of Daffy's Roundtable. Before we get into the introduction for this episode, let me quickly apologize for disappearing in January. I was doing some traveling and found it very hard to record episodes and edit without my setup, but now we're back to regularly scheduled content. For this episode, my guest is Billy Sveen of Creepersherpetoculture. Billy was a guest on Project Herpetoculture where they talked about developing his 10 tenants, what they included, and the importance of developing tenants as keepers. By the way, this is a really good episode that I highly recommend you check out. I enjoyed this episode so much that I decided to have Billy on to discuss burnout in the hobby, tailoring your reptile selection to your reptile room design, and his mindset when it comes to herpetoculture in general. But before we do that, allow me to, as always, thank Exoterra for sponsoring this podcast and making this episode happen. Exoterra makes quality products for our pet reptiles to make them feel at home. Yes, we're still teamed up with Exoterra in 2023, and I've got a few exciting things in the works, so make sure you stay tuned to this channel and to my other channel, Daffy's Reptiles. Okay, without further ado, let's get into this week's conversation with Billy Sveen of Creepers Herpetoculture. Billy, hello.
Hey,
How are you doing
good to see
today?
you. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. I'm very excited to do this. Okay, so let's dive right in.
Sure.
How did you what's the Billy story? How did you get into the hobby, and what are you currently keeping?
Yeah, I guess I was always catching reptiles and enthusiastic about dragons and mythical creatures was kind of my inroad as a little kid. And so finding salamanders and snakes and all those stuff up in like the North Dakota, Minnesota area. Convinced my parents to get me a bearded dragon for my 11th birthday.
Nice.
And in high school was having a bunch of different geckos kind of in my room. Had to get rid of a lot of that stuff for college. My mom was wonderful enough to keep my bearded dragon. And so then I got him back 4 years later and had him until he was about 14 and he died. But for a while there, he was like my only pet reptile. And then I got ball python, royal python, and have now that one's like 7 years old. And then about 2 years ago now, done moving around for work and training and things, and bought my first house and started making this is my like home office and started making this into the area where I keep my reptiles. And so figured that was the time to dive in and get back involved in the hobby in a more serious level. And so started getting dark frogs. So I have one tank of Dendrobates leucomelis, and that's just like right to the side here. I made a nice bigger vivarium for my pythons, and she's right down here.
I should maybe keep it bigger for while we do
That's
that.
fine. I mean,
Then.
so
Okay, there we go. Awesome.
her enclosure. And then I got a Lagodactylus conraui Cameroon dwarf day gecko, and that's like right here. So they're all just kind of around me, and I have plans to slowly expand and keep building my ability to care for these animals with a high standard of care and really engage as many aspects of their natural history as I can.
Awesome. Okay, so really, I wanted to have you on because of your mentality towards the hobby
Sure.
and the kind of the way you think of things. Because well, we've spoken for a bunch on Instagram, but then also
Yeah.
heard you on the Project Herpetoculture, and that was an incredible
Sure.
episode where you talked about the 10 tenants. So we're not going to dive into the 10 tenants today because that was a really well done episode, and I think everybody should go check that out. But I do have like a couple of questions revolving around the
Sure.
tenants, if we could maybe jump
Yeah.
into that for a second.
Yeah.
So, first of all, maybe can you explain what tenants are and what originally gave you the idea to create them?
Sure. Yeah. So shout out real quick to Roy and Phil for inviting me on their podcast. So it's yeah, you can hear it there on the Animals at Home Network. It's nice and long if you're interested in listening to me talk for a couple hours.
It's an awesome episode. I definitely recommend it.
Yeah. So the tenants. So as I was going back in and getting more serious about it, again, I never was like without a reptile or frog really. But as I was going back in, I had the idea that I could get in too deep or overwhelmed, and I wanted to have a focus. So for the first time, I had space. I had an adult income. It was very different than when I was 16 and like had to convince my parents to get another 10-gallon tank. And I didn't want that mentality. I didn't want to be trying to figure out how many different kinds of geckos I could line on the shelves in my room. I wanted to make my office look more like a jungle or like a zoo, have
Right.
a different standard. And so as I was thinking about how to do that in a sustainable, ethical way, and just kind of the way my brain works, I decided to write down my like ethos of how I was going to go about doing that. And so that's how that came about. And then, like, as I was sorting them out, 10 just ended up being the number that it kind of came to, which seemed like a good number to have.
Yeah, it's always nice to have like a round
Yeah.
number kind of thing.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so the question is, do you think that everyone should have their own tenants, and do you think that everyone's tenants would be necessarily the same as yours, or yeah, what's your opinion on
Yeah. The second part, absolutely not.
that?
Um, should everyone have their own tenants? Uh, I think everyone should reflect on why they do what they do. And I think that goes well beyond herpetoculture. But for sure, since we have a practice where we are taking other living creatures and becoming responsible for them, I think it's important to reflect on that. Whether that means you really like sit down and meticulously pick through the words of setting out like your mission, I don't think that's necessary to be able to do it really well. I know just when people contacting me after listening to that episode, people that have way more animals than me and are doing a really high level of care haven't necessarily pieced through all of this for themselves. And so obviously it's not a prerequisite for doing a really good job. I think it's a good practice to reflect on things actively, and lots of people do that, even if it's not actually writing them down. For that second part, to say a little bit more about that, should everyone say the things I said? No. So I am like, I'll probably breed some things, but I'm not that interested in doing that at a big scale. I want to have a wide variety of animals instead of like really focusing on one thing. And so that would change quite a bit depending on what you're doing. Like my interest in the feeder insects, for example, is something that I think a lot of people wouldn't share, and is really only doable if you're going to have small things, or if you want to like dedicate a really gross room to crickets, which I would never do.
No.
So yeah, there are some idiosyncrasies that are specific to me in there. There are some other things I think are good that I see lots of people doing that aren't unique to me, like thinking of your animal as a commitment for its entire life, and breeding things responsibly so that you don't overproduce an animal that you don't have good homes for them to go to. Those types of things I see widely throughout the hobby as far as people that I look up to.
Yeah, awesome. And one of the ones, or one of the ones that I really liked out of the tenants was, and I'm definitely not phrasing this right, but sort of where you talk about keeping smaller sized animals in larger sized enclosures. Why do you think that's a good way to do it? Which
Yeah,
I agree, by the way, but
yeah,
yeah.
so I think you need, so there's a minimum size you need to be able to give the right gradients and maintain those. Then there's the ability for the animal to show all of its natural, or at least a lot of its natural behaviors. So if you have a snake that climbs and hides and perches, you need to be able to have enough room to create those gradients and have the space for the snake to do those things. And so that's a fairly big area. And so when I think about that for example, with my frogs, they have lots of, they're essentially in a, like a tall 40 gallon, like it's a custom made tank, but there's 3 of them in there, and they have a lot of space. It could definitely be bigger. It would be awesome to be bigger, but they can hop around and do all sorts of their behaviors as far as hunting and hiding and calling and foraging and exploring through all the little nooks and crannies in there. And it's so much easier to do that in a small space, even or for a small animal. So even like my dwarf gecko, the ability to get small branches that the thing will never be able to break or damage, and then have those crisscross the entire enclosure. And it was like, I don't know, $10 to like buy like nice branches to do that, versus it would cost 10 times that to do something even just a little bit bigger, because you need to get so much bigger branches. Is another like good example for it.
And a bigger enclosure and bigger space. And
yeah, like doing the same thing in an enclosure twice the size is not just twice the amount of effort, it's a lot more.
Yeah,
knowing from doing that for the like 120 gallon python enclosure that I did, it was significantly more work.
Yeah, and I'd love to. We'll definitely get to that because there's a interesting like.
Sure.
You did the whole shift from tub to enclosure, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Definitely touch on that. But before we get to kind of the reptile room and all that, one thing you mentioned a few times there is getting overwhelmed. You were worried about getting overwhelmed. You've seen bigger keepers and breeders sort of not having the tenants as well, and maybe they're not getting overwhelmed, but the potential of a lot of people going down that path and at some point getting overwhelmed is, I think, very clear, and I think we're seeing it a lot more in the hobby now. It's almost like a very constant thing to see. I can't keep up with my reptile room. I'm selling a bunch of things off right now. So why do you think that people are getting to that stage, and what do you think we can do to prevent the burnout or people getting overwhelmed and all that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of aspects to it. One is, if you're wanting to breed things, it takes a few years. So, 2 to 3 years, probably, if you're getting babies of something. And so if you have the resources to keep getting stuff, all of a sudden you're 3 years in and you have a dozen pairs or colonies or whatever you have, and now all of a sudden all of them are multiplying when a year or two ago none of them were. And so I think that can be exceedingly overwhelming. It's exciting to get something new. It's exciting to research something and to think about it and plan for it. And so I think that's something that we can, Dylan Perrin talks about this all the time, harness that and reinvest that into making your care better. So instead of getting the excitement about getting a new animal, the excitement's about adding a new type of prey item for the animal, or adding a new plant into their enclosure and trying to make it so that that can work, or changing the lighting system so that's automated in a different way, and getting the pleasure out of that and the research deeper into animals you already have, rather than just grabbing new ones. Not to say I'm not going to get new animals. I very much plan to get new animals, but I'm going to do that slowly so that I don't overwhelm myself. I think COVID is a great example. We didn't, no one thought that this is exactly how these years were going to go, right? Even people that think a pandemic is likely to happen even again. You don't know when those types of things are going to happen and how that's going to affect your life. I mean, when I was 16 and I had to get rid of, that's kind of like the peak of the animals I have. And then when I was 18, I had to get rid of them. I wasn't thinking about what I was going to be doing in 10 years. I now am, part of that's having kids and having a job and working through all that stuff and just being older. But I'm thinking about what I'm going to be doing in 5, 10, 20 years. and I don't want to have to scale back. I want to be able to maintain where I am and slowly, responsibly move forward.
Yeah, no, that's awesome answer. Exactly. I think that's another important thing to consider, which like where you're gonna be in 5, 10, 15 years.
Because that's
Are
the
you going to
lifespan of
be
these things. Like a lot of these
100%?
animals, 10 is a somewhat low lifespan. There are definitely some animals that's a good natural life for them, but a lot of them it's 15, 20, 30.
30, yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And if you keep turtles and tortoises, even longer.
Oh, so much longer.
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, awesome. So, you mentioned there that you're designing a reptile room, or you're expanding
Yeah.
your reptile room, your collection. Um, how do you go about? So, you've talked about this before, like, or you mentioned it on the Project Herpetoculture episode, where you kind of tailor the species you're getting to the reptile room, but also
Hmm.
tailor the designing the reptile room to what species you kind of want to keep.
Yeah.
So like, so why do you think it's a good idea to design the reptile room, and like, like, what's your opinion on why did you do it, basically?
Yeah. So this room is, I mean, I'm fortunate to have a space in my home that's my like home office, and I kind of do what I want with it. And so it's like 10 feet by 14 feet, and I can have as many animals as I can responsibly fit in here. And so what I was thinking, I knew I wanted dart frogs because I knew I would want to, they'd be like a perfect animal to be able to, um, just look over and see them hopping around in during the day, during my when I need a little break. And so that was kind of the vision. And when I started looking through Denderboard and other websites and seeing people's collections, the idea of having like a wall of dart frogs was something that you see fairly often. And then I started thinking, what if they weren't all dart frogs? What if they were other kinds of geckos, salamanders, tree frogs, other kinds of animals? And so that's the thing that I thought. And then when I had this house, um, I need to be able to work in this room, so I don't want it to be 80 degrees
For
or
sure.
90 degrees. And so trying to think about what animals can I put in here that like it, what we call room temperature. And a lot of those tropical forest floor species are like that. And then also, since it's not a massive room, it's hard to make something really hot, something really cold. It's hard to make something really dry and something really wet. And so, and the difference between being wet and being humid is important too. And still, the idea of getting things well ventilated. So I made the decision to humidify the room. So I have a humidifier that keeps the room around like 50 to 60. It's a little hard during the winter. It sometimes only keeps it in the 40s, but significantly different than the rest of my house. And then that makes it pretty easy to keep the enclosures 60, 80, 90, whatever I really want it to be without too much extra work. So yeah, if it's not clear what I'm trying to have a lot of tropical species that like it in the low 70s, mid 70s for their ambient, with maybe a slightly higher temperature toward the top, which naturally happens even if you don't have like big basking lamps. And then I'm going to make a lot of things out of PVC is the plan. And so that will insulate heat and reduce the heat, and put hoods over things that need heat. But as of right now, the only thing that needs a significant amount of heat is the Python. And I built a hood for that enclosure, which as of right now, I'm only putting a few 45-watt bulbs in there, and it keeps the temperature nicely. And so it's bearable to sit right next to it.
So that was actually my next question. Like, what do you think for people who want to keep, an arid hot species with like a cool tropical one in the same room? Do you think it's doable? But I
Sure.
guess that would be one way to do it. Put a hood on it, keep it a little bit further away from where you're sitting.
Yeah, it's doable, but it's going to be a lot of work. And if you're going to have a lot of things like that, the people that, if you're going to have a lot of reptiles, it's going to take up a room or take up parts of multiple rooms of your house. Like that's the way it's going to be.
100%.
And so a lot of people have a hot room and a cool room, or a temperate room and a arid room, or a tropical room. They have their cloud forest room that gets really cold. You know, like people do that. And at least the way it is right now, and the way it is for the foreseeable future, I have this room. I don't really have the rest of the house, and I'm very fortunate to have one room that I can do whatever I want with. And looking through the species I wanted, again, like really centering in on the poison dart frogs. Now I'm centering everything around that. So the things that work well are some of the other tree frogs, like glass frogs, other poison frogs, some of the New Caledonian geckos. I'm really interested in the Urodactyloides.
Nice.
So they're even smaller than like a crested gecko.
Yeah.
Some of the like what people call micro geckos, or other like Phelsumid geckos. They and so the micro geckos would be like Spherodactylus, Gonatodes. They require a little hotspot, but you're talking like a 15-watt bulb, not like a big bulb. And so, and if you have a big enough cage, that's not a big deal and won't heat things up, and I could put them on the top. So those are things I'm interested in. Also, Goniurosaurus, the cave geckos, they like it nice and cool. I don't know if Uroplatus would work in here because it might get too warm at times, but those are things that I'd be interested in too, potentially. Mantellas. So already I'm saying too many things.
Yeah.
They can't all be in here.
The wall will fill up pretty quickly.
Exactly.
But that's how it goes, right? Yeah.
But there's so many options is what I'm trying to get at, even within that constraint of relatively cool temperatures, tropical. Like there are some species that I'd love to have that just won't fit that room. And maybe in the future, kids are older, kids want an animal in their room or something, you know, then maybe we'll switch something else up. But
you convince them that that's the animal they want in their room.
Yeah, exactly. Don't you think you really want a dwarf reticulated python?
No. So I've actually kept Gonatodes and Spherodactylus.
Yeah.
What's your opinion? And this might be different for you because you're actually working in the room, so maybe you get a chance to see them more often. But what's your opinion on animals that are hiding most of the time or something like that? Because and another like disclaimer there, I've seen many Gonatodes and Spherodactylus species that don't hide all the time, but the two that I kept were, I didn't see them too often. So like, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I definitely like to see my animals. So the Dendrobates leucomelis poison frogs I picked I specifically picked them because they're good beginner frogs and they're relatively bold. And I'm like not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure the next thing I'm going to add to the room are Phyllobates terribilis, which are like
super bold,
known to be like the boldest of dart frogs.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I like to be able to see the animals. So the Urodactyloides, again, even though they're crepuscular nocturnal, they often hide in plain sight, and they're just like laying out on a branch, so you can see them even during the day. And then like glass frogs would be something I can then see at night, for example.
You can even see them sleeping during the day.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I think some of those micro geckos are so shy, but from what I've read, there are some species that are better than others, and so maybe something I'll look into. They're a bit further down the list, probably for that reason, though. The heat and that.
For sure, it's interesting because some people will say, I like to see my animals, and other people will say I don't mind not seeing them because when I see them, it's even more special. It's like a surprise. Yeah. But I like to see my animals too. I completely agree with you. I want to look like at any point to see them. Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, and especially now, like the poison frog vivarium is relatively overgrown, and so it's pretty rare that I see all three. And there's definitely times where I look over and I can't see any of them. Yeah. But I still really like it. I think it's a really pretty
Piece of artwork in your
yeah, it's
home.
like
Yeah.
it's a slice of the jungle sitting on my desk. It's like just amazing that it's there, and I can throw in a few dozen little fruit flies, and they'll come out pretty quick.
They
So
come storming out.
yeah,
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 100%. Awesome. Okay, so let's sort of get into the enclosures
sure,
with the, the transition of you're also very into DIY.
yeah,
So what do you think the advantage of doing DIY is versus buying ready-made products?
sure. You get to customize them yourself, so you don't have to retrofit and fruit fly proof
Yes.
enclosures when you can build them the way you want them. You can have as much or little ventilation as you want. So, like the first enclosure I made, I followed Troy Goldberg's layout pretty much verbatim,
The Euro
which was,
style ones?
yep, exactly, for the poison frog
Right.
enclosure, and it worked really well. But on future ones, and I've made like smaller things for like a praying mantis, and then for the dwarf gecko, and I have more ventilation, especially for how small the enclosure is on those, because I've decided to humidify the room, and so it's so much more customizable. It's cheaper for what I think is a better product. Like I like sliding doors instead of swinging doors. I like to be able to take them off all the way. So I think that's fun. There's a sense of accomplishment and achievement in knowing that you've put it together. And I think it causes you to slow down and have a sense of achievement every step of the way. The achievement is not just I bought this animal. The achievement is I built the enclosure. Now I have completed the background. Now I've planted it and set up a micro environment. Now that's all really well established and it's been a couple months. Now I can introduce the animal. And so from the planning to seeing the animal in the enclosure is like half a year in my experience doing this a couple times now. And I like that process. And
And
I
then you
think
have
that's a healthy
maintenance.
process for the hobby for me.
No, I agree. No, for the hobby, like you said, it's more than just throw it together, throw the animal in, forget about it, move on to the
Yeah,
next tank, right? It's
yeah,
there's a whole process, and like saying like there's maintenance afterwards as well. How are you gonna just set it up and let it just overgrow and do its thing, or are you gonna
sure,
maintain it and
yeah.
no, that's awesome. Okay, so you built the Dart Frog vivarium,
Hmm.
and did you build all the enclosures in that you have set up?
Uh, yeah,
Okay,
yep. So I
awesome.
built the Dart Frog vivarium. It's like a standard. It'd be half of a baker's rack shelf essentially. Is how Troy Goldberg did his measurements. Um, then the um, Python enclosure is a 2 foot by 2 foot by or sorry 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, so 120 gallon, and then it has a almost like a foot deep hood that goes over the top of it too, and so that's all PVC that I made with my father-in-law, and
Awesome.
so that was fun to make. And then I've made a couple smaller tanks that are like 6 gallons, one for a praying mantis and one for the dwarf gecko.
Yeah, and for the dwarf gecko, I guess maybe you fruit fly proofed it, but you also escape proofed it for the gecko.
Yeah, yeah, I can. Actually, that door's pretty hard to get out. Trying to. The tubing is far away, but yeah,
No,
it's
that's okay. Yeah, yeah, it's okay.
it's tubing. So I've done like the silicone method where you tape it off, lay a bead of silicone, use a credit card that you like measure the distance between the doors and like cut a nick out of the credit card and swipe it down and pull it off. You should have like a perfect like rectangle of silicone. I've done another method where you like essentially glue the doors together, but put lotion on one of the doors so that it doesn't stick to the other door, and then you cut it down. But there's always some imperfections, which is fine for fruit flies because it like greatly reduces. If you feed the appropriate amount, you barely get any come out, and the fruit flies, if they really try, can get through mesh even too.
Yeah.
So that's not a big deal. But when I put a baby gecko in there that's going to explore every nook, you can't let the one baby gecko get out. So that was a higher bar. And initially I just had in a 1 gallon jar that I had redone the top for and stuff. And there's no way it was going to get out of that. But then when I went to this, it's like little silicone tubing that's to protect the edges of metal, like a door of a car. So it's adhesive on one side and then like flappy on the other, that it's just loose. And
Yeah.
so it expands to fill that surface so that you could put on different thicknesses of a door is the idea. And so, yeah, it expands to fit the other side of the door and you can slide it open really easily. Versus like I was experimenting and trying it on the Python enclosure, and I used window weather stripping, and I had to, so it's really adhesive and works well. It was black, which is why I did it on there, because it doesn't matter. I have a support bar in the middle anyway. It's all hidden. I didn't want to do it in the middle of a enclosure where you could see that a big black line down the middle.
Right.
But I had to continuously like shave off pieces of it because it kept on grading as the door slides past. But this one, I mean, it opens and closes super easy.
Had the Lycodactylus for a while now, and maybe this goes back to what you were saying earlier about smaller species in large enclosures. But what do you think of them as a pet? Do you recommend them?
Yeah, I think they're fun. They're, from everything I've seen, I've never had a Lycodactylus williamsi, but they seem very similar in care and temperament and boldness. So all this with a grain of salt, considering I just have one and it's a juvenile still. It's like 4 months old, but it's getting more and more bold by the day, it seems like. Doesn't hide from me nearly as much. When it was little, it was really bold in that tiny 1 gallon, but then when I moved it into this like 5-6 gallon enclosure, it started to hide again. But now it's out perching and hunting and stuff. It's fun to see. I love the colors of it. Like there's something very cool about a blue gecko, because I feel like that's the comparison you always have to make, is them versus a williamsi.
Yeah.
But I like the green to bluish with like a little bit of like yellow that the males get, and I think the females are cool too. It's cool to have something that is so sexually dimorphic, which is also true of the williamsi.
Yeah. Do you know? I guess 4 months is probably too young to sex yours now, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. And if it is early enough, it's definitely not male.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It's still very like the gray with a little bit of reddish on the tail.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah. I've only raised a few babies, but all the ones that I've raised are still around that stage now too. Okay. So I thought they were all going female, but maybe they're just not ready to sex as well. So I know exactly what you mean. You put out. Okay, let's talk about the python for a minute. So you put out this interesting on Instagram, where you were explaining why you think they should be called royal pythons instead of ball pythons.
Yeah.
I think that's awesome. Why do you think so? So maybe
Yeah, it's a cooler name. Like if you're just trying to market the animal, royal python is an awesome name. It's also what their binomial name is too, Python regius. Like that's what it refers to. And I've heard a few different ideas of why, one of which that I think is cool is the idea of West African indigenous people regarding them as like sacred or special, and even like having them as an adornment, like a priest having one around their wrist, which if you've held them, you know they do very readily just like wrap around and hold there
for a long time.
I think the calling them a ball python, like they curl up into balls, like that's like a natural position they have, but it's also a defense posture. And so it's something that I try to not encourage my python to do. Like ideally, when I'm seeing the python, she's relaxed and moving about, doing her normal thing. And when I pick her up, she has nothing to fear because she knows what we're doing and she's used to it. And so I think royal fits her better than inanimate object, a ball.
No,
But
that you're okay.
I also feel it does feel, and it's what people across the pond say all the time is royal pythons.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I feel like a little bit pretentious saying royal python, so I often say both. But yeah, I think it's a better name. I think it's pretty, like, objectively a better name.
So you recently, or I don't know how recently, but you moved your ball. Say I'm still used to saying ball python,
That's
so we're
cool.
gonna go with
Yeah, that's good.
ball python from a tub into a enclosure. What was the reason behind making the move?
Yeah, sure. So when I first got the snake, so 7 years ago, I looked up what I thought were reasonable sources, like Reptiles magazine and the forums that were widely about at that time. And I wasn't spending, I mean, I probably spent hours, well, even just listening to podcasts, I clearly spend hours a week
Yeah.
taking in herpetoculture information. I wasn't doing that back then. But I would say I did my homework and figured out how to care for this animal. But the things I saw were about rat keeping. And so I duplicated that for one animal. So I had one animal, but I got a sterilite tub and made that and increased the tub size as the animal got bigger, not even realizing how cool it would be to make a full enclosure. So then when I got this room, it took a while to get things settled, but then I got kind of like the biggest tote that I could reasonably find that she wouldn't be able to escape from. And I put substrate in there. I modified the lids, like put overhead lighting, and I put branches in there, and multiple hides instead of just like one hide, and in a bigger bowl. And definitely saw more activity from her. Saw her get out and explore that around, but like not even, definitely not enough space for her to all the way stretch out. Definitely not enough space for her to explore very much. But she would like poke her head out every once in a while, and it was always the goal to then get her into a big enclosure. I don't always like the idea of like minimum sizes because I think there's not all space is equal, and so there's a lot you can do. If you think of a 4x2 foot enclosure, that could still be quite minimal, especially if you're putting your lights on the inside versus you have your lights on the outside. And I have like a top layer that she can be on that creates a hide, and then there's burrowed down hides in there too, and then there's cork bark that she can go through in the middle. And so the whole thing, there's different areas for her to feel secure, and it's planted throughout. Could I make it bigger? Absolutely. And that could be fun to do in the future. We'll see. But this was a great place to start. But I was still concerned that it might be too complex of an environment for her, especially as she wasn't young. She's 7 years old. But she transitioned fairly well from what I would call like a somewhat complex tub. Also, it was clear tub, so you could see through it.
Okay.
As you could see me moving around throughout the day. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And do you see? I guess you already sort of covered this. After she's been in there for a while, do you see any behavioral changes, anything like that? Yeah.
Yeah. So she's been in there for a month. At first, she really did explore. Like I put her in there early in the morning, and she explored for about half an hour before she went into the cool side hide. I think it's the hide she found first, and she really stayed in there for a long time. Where I made me nervous. Like she stayed in there maybe she came out at night and went back in, but she was always in there, and sometimes looked like she was in like the exact same spot, which again she did in the other enclosure too. And then I moved the lights over and I made that the warm hide. And then in like 2 days, she was definitely coming out a little bit more. And now I've changed the lights and decreased the wattage a little bit because now she's in she went to the other cool hide, essentially, the new cool hide. and now I've made them so they're not the same temperature. They're still a warm and a cool one, but they're more equal. And I wonder if that's part of it, because even though I only heated one side of her big tub, the whole thing was more or less the same ambient temperature, with one hide being a little bit warmer.
Okay.
And so right now I have a true cool end and a true hot end. And so I wonder if that gradient, she doesn't like know how to explore as much. So I kind of like guided her into where I think she should be. And I'll continue to experiment with that. But then after she went over there, I don't feed her on a schedule. I feed her when she's like in her ambush mode at night. And again, just because I don't have very many animals, it's not a big deal to keep track of that. And I've tried to feed her even though she wasn't doing that at the end of like a 2-week period when she was on the cool side, and she didn't take it, which was the first time she'd missed a meal in a long time, but kind of made sense. Then when I put her on the warm, got her to go over to like a warmer side, she went into that ambush mode like within 2 nights, and took a small, medium-sized rat, and then still was doing that like every night. And so like 3 nights later, I gave her a chick, and she took that fine. And she still like goes into ambush mode almost every night. Like as soon as the lights go out, if I walk in, or especially if I open the glass, she just she's comes ready. Out. Yeah, it's awesome. It's that's really awesome. And that's more activity than I normally see from her. Even now with like all the lights on, if I open the glass and start coming on there, she'll stick her head out and look around.
So I had a similar situation actually with my carpet python. When I first got him, or I say him, I don't actually know if it's him, but when I first got him, he the breeder told me keep him something small or he won't eat or he stop eating. Yep. And I actually did upgrade him when he was like 2 years ago now or something into a slightly bigger thing, and he did stop eating, so I moved him back down. Mm-hmm. So I had him in a small enclosure for a very long time. But once I upgraded him into like a proper setup and all that, he's always in the ambush mode. Like you said, I don't feed on a schedule either. So he'll come out and he waits, and now it's usually he'll accept food not a little more readily, a lot more. Like it's almost anytime I feed him, he's ready to eat. But what do you think the advantages are of feeding on a schedule versus feeding, or like what do you? Yeah, so obviously you feed off schedule. So
yeah. I mean, I think if you have a lot of animals, feeding on a schedule makes sense. I mean, I feed on a schedule for my other animals. It's essentially feed them almost every day. But if you have 20 snakes, it probably makes sense to feed them on Fridays, and then the adults every other Friday, or something.
Yeah.
And then you can just keep track, and maybe you look at them and you're like, oh, that's in shed, or it's really not coming out, and so I'm going to skip this week. Again, a situation I haven't really been in, but that kind of makes sense. Whereas for me, it's not a big deal to be like, oh, I've noticed that she's coming out and looking like she's hungry 2 nights in a row. I'm going to thaw 1 rat tonight. Like, that's easy to do.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
I get during the cool time, I don't change her lighting a lot because they're pretty equatorial, but the room naturally gets a little bit cooler, and I do change the lights a little bit. And there's a window like directly in front of me right now. And so the room itself gets darker even if her lights stay on.
Right.
And I think that changes things, because for years she often goes a month or 2 between feeds during the winter.
Okay.
That's not uncommon for her to do, even though I'm not like really cooling her.
Okay, and did she do that this year as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. It makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, she probably had gone 3 weeks without eating, when I had, or between eating, when I had moved her into the new vivarium. Okay. And then she went 2 to 3 weeks before I fed her. Now it does seem like maybe I could feed her a lot more often. So I don't know what the new cadence is going to be in the new vivarium. I don't know.
I wonder the topic of feeding on a schedule very frequently and not feeding very frequently, because I feed a lot of them sort of semi, like you said, on a schedule. Like my frogs and geckos are always like these days a week they're getting their fruit flies and their apache, but with with my snake is just the one, but I try to feed him off schedule as much as possible because I
Same.
want to
Yeah.
see, or like it's there's two things, right? There's the thing of pythons gaining weight really quickly because
Yes.
they generally don't eat that often, and then there's also the, if we're just feeding them, are we getting them used to never coming out of the hides, and just because, like you
Right.
said, that ambush mode is kind of when he comes out,
Hmm.
and kind of walks around. So it's a very very interesting topic.
Yeah,
That I really touched more
I've
on.
never done any target training, and I'm curious about how she'll would take to that because she's older, but it's something I'm
Right.
interested in doing. But at the very least, I'm interested in doing um, some more complex like feed boxes where she has to explore for the food.
No, interesting.
So,
Okay.
um, take like a Tupperware container, cut a hole in it, and make a tube that the snake has to go into to get the food, or like do a scent trail. So, um, take the rat and kind of drag it across the ground, and then put it up high and just leave it there and see if
That is
she gets it throughout the night. So those are things I'm interested in doing that I haven't tried yet.
okay. That's I so those are very interesting. So kind of like puzzle games for dogs and
Yeah,
stuff like
yeah,
that. So do you generally tongue feed, or do you generally just leave the prey item
yeah. I
in
tongue feed. There are
okay.
times where she doesn't get it, or she doesn't seem interested, and then I'll drop feed, and she has done that before. But almost always, if she doesn't take it from a tongue, she's not going to take it
Okay.
otherwise. So I don't know if it will really work, but it's something I'm interested in trying.
Yeah, because so I've gotten a snake used to a pair of tongs and a hook, and
Mhm.
so he kind of knows whether, like when he sees the hook, or he sees the, or I think he knows at least,
Sure. Yeah.
that okay, it's time to eat, or time to just go hang out. So I wonder if trying those, like you said, trying those things, if not the food's not on a tongue, if he will try to go look for it,
Yeah.
or all of
Maybe.
that. But it's super interesting. These are
Yeah.
the little things that make the hobby fun, which is, as you were saying before,
Yeah.
kind of spend your energy and your time researching and doing these kind of things rather than just constantly expanding
And
and all of
I
that.
would say having her feed that first time in this vivarium was as exciting as getting a new animal.
I guess,
Like it
yeah,
was
or
that
seeing it for the
same.
first time.
I was like texting lots of people on Instagram and stuff like, guess what just happened?
Shit.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. No, that's sweet. Uh, all right, perfect, Billy. That, I think that's all the questions I had for you for today.
Cool. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for coming on and doing this.
Yeah.
Like I said, I love your mentality and your enthusiasm towards the hobby, and I hope more people start adopting similar, like-minded opinions. But can you let everybody know where they can find you?
Yeah. Well, it's been a real pleasure. And it's been fun getting to know you on Instagram and finally getting to
Yes,
talk to you.
yes.
So,
Likewise,
um,
likewise.
thanks for inviting me. Yeah.
For sure.
So on Instagram, I am Creepersherpetoculture. Sometimes people ask why that name. The herpetos in herpetoculture means creeping animal or creeping ones.
Okay.
And so I'm embracing that, reclaiming the term creeping. So
I
Creepers
like it.
Herpetoculture on Instagram is really my only presence. I guess I'm technically on Facebook too, but it links to my Instagram.
Awesome, awesome, and that'll be in the show notes. Go give him a follow. Keep an eye on all of his posts and his DIYs and his stories, because it's all very very interesting. Billy, once again, thank you very much for coming on, man. And for everyone else, welcome back to the new year. I know I haven't posted in a while, so once again, thank you for all for sticking around. I am Daffy's Reptiles on all social media platforms. Daffy's Roundtable for the podcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.